The radio studio buzzed with tension as Mark Levin sat behind his microphone, his face already red with anger, before the show even began. The 67-year-old conservative radio host had spent weeks preparing for this moment, a live debate with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett that would be broadcast to millions of listeners nationwide. Just moments before going live, Levin had declared backstage, "This young woman thinks she knows the Constitution better than me. I've been studying law since before she was born. I'll show America what happens when inexperience meets expertise." But what Levin didn't know was that Crockett, sitting calmly across from him in her navy blazer, had her own surprise ready. The 33-year-old former public defender and current Congresswoman had spent her entire career mastering constitutional law in ways that theoretical radio debates could never teach. The red recording light flicked on, and Levin immediately launched into his opening attack. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who apparently believes her few years in politics make her a constitutional scholar. Well, we'll see about that." His voice boomed through the studio speakers, but Crockett sat perfectly still, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had faced much tougher opponents in courtrooms across the country, and she knew something Levin didn't. Sometimes, the loudest voice in the room is actually the weakest. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these incredible political showdowns that are reshaping American discourse. Mark Levin represented the old guard of conservative commentary, a man who had built his reputation on decades of radio broadcasts, best-selling books about the Constitution, and fiery speeches at political rallies. At 67, he commanded respect from millions of conservative Americans who tuned in daily to hear his passionate defenses of constitutional principles. His resume was impressive. Former Chief of Staff to Attorney General Edwin Meese, author of multiple books including Liberty and Tyranny and the Liberty Amendments, and host of one of the most popular conservative radio shows in America. Levin genuinely believed that his years of study and commentary had given him unparalleled expertise in constitutional law. But today, he would face an opponent unlike any other he had encountered on his show. Jasmine Crockett had traveled a different path to constitutional expertise. Growing up in Missouri, she had witnessed firsthand how constitutional principles played out in real people's lives, not just in theoretical debates, but in courtrooms where freedom and justice hung in the balance. After earning her law degree, Crockett had spent years as a public defender, representing clients who couldn't afford expensive attorneys. She had argued constitutional issues before judges, fought for Fourth Amendment protections during illegal searches, and defended First Amendment rights for people whose voices had been silenced by the system. When she was elected to Congress, she brought that real-world constitutional experience with her. Unlike many politicians who relied on staff briefings and talking points, Crockett could cite case law from memory because she had lived it, argued it, and won with it. The stakes of this confrontation were enormous. This wasn't just about two people debating constitutional theory. It represented a clash between different approaches to understanding America's founding document. Levin represented the academic, theoretical approach favored by conservative commentators. Crockett represented the practical, lived experience of constitutional law in action. For Levin, this debate was about maintaining his credibility as the conservative movement's constitutional authority. For Crockett, it was about proving that real expertise comes from actual practice, not just passionate commentary. The contrast between them was stark. Levin's loud, aggressive style that had made him a radio star versus Crockett's calm, measured approach honed by years in courtrooms. His theoretical knowledge versus her practical experience. His need to entertain an audience versus her commitment to constitutional accuracy. As the debate began, both participants knew that millions of Americans would judge not just their arguments, but their approaches to constitutional interpretation. The winner would claim the mantle of constitutional authority, while the loser would face questions about their credentials and credibility. Levin wasted no time launching his first major attack, His voice rose to the near shout that had made him famous. "Congresswoman, you and your progressive colleagues have been trampling on the Constitution since day one. You support policies that would make the founders roll over in their graves. Tell me, what gives you the authority to lecture anyone about constitutional law?" The studio fell silent for a moment as Crockett calmly adjusted her microphone. Her response was measured but firm. "Mr. Levin, I appreciate the question. My authority comes from the same place any lawyer's does, from studying the law, practicing it, and defending it in court. Before I came to Congress, I spent years as a public defender, arguing constitutional cases before judges. I didn't just read about the Fourth Amendment, I defended it when police conducted illegal searches. Didn't just theorize about due process. I fought for it when prosecutors tried to deny my clients fair trials." Levin's face reddened further. He had expected talking points, not this direct challenge to his expertise. "Reading cases and arguing in local courtrooms doesn't make you a constitutional scholar," he shot back. "I've been studying constitutional law since before you were born. I've written best-selling books about the Constitution. I understand the original intent of the founders in ways that your progressive law school professors never taught you." But Crockett wasn't intimidated. She leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining calm, but gaining strength. "Mr. Levin, with all due respect, writing books about the Constitution and actually practicing constitutional law are very different things. You talk about original intent. Well, let me tell you about actual implementation. When I defended a client whose home was searched without a warrant, I didn't just cite the Fourth Amendment in theory. I had to understand how it actually works, how judges interpret it, and how it protects real people from government overreach." The tension in the studio was building. Levin's producers could see their host getting more agitated, which usually made for good radio. But something was different this time. Instead of his opponent backing down under his aggressive questioning, Crockett seemed to be gaining confidence. With each exchange, this revelation seemed to shock not just Levin, but his entire production team. The narrative they had constructed, progressive congresswoman versus conservative constitutional expert, was falling apart. Here was someone who had actually defended conservative constitutional principles in court, not just talked about them on the radio. Levin struggled to regain his footing. "Well, that's all well and good, but your current voting record shows you've abandoned those principles for political expediency." "Mr. Levin," Crockett replied, "there's a difference between defending constitutional rights in court and making legislative policy decisions in Congress. As a lawyer, my job was to defend the Constitution as it exists. As a legislator, my job is to create policy within constitutional constraints while serving my constituents' needs. Those are different roles requiring different approaches, but both require deep constitutional understanding." By now, it was clear to everyone listening that this debate had become something unprecedented. Instead of the usual political theater, they were witnessing a constitutional law seminar, with Crockett as the professor and Levin as the increasingly frustrated student. Sensing his opponent's growing discomfort, Crockett decided to press her advantage with another demonstration of practical constitutional knowledge. "Mr. Levin, since we're discussing constitutional interpretation, let me ask you about the necessary and proper clause. How do you reconcile strict constructionist views with McCulloch versus Maryland's broad interpretation of congressional power?" Levin hesitated again. This was exactly the kind of specific constitutional question that separated real expertise from passionate commentary. "Well, McCulloch was a foundational case about federal supremacy and implied powers," he said. But his answer was vague. "Actually," Crockett continued, "McCulloch established much more than that. Chief Justice Marshall held that Congress has implied powers that aren't explicitly listed in the Constitution, as long as they're necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated powers. But he also established a test. The means must be legitimate. The end must be within the scope of the Constitution, and the means must be appropriate and plainly adapted to that end." I've used that exact test in cases challenging federal overreach, both to defend federal authority when it's constitutional and to challenge it when it exceeds constitutional limits. The detailed explanation left Levin speechless for several seconds, an eternity in radio time. His producers began to panic, gesturing frantically from behind the studio glass. Recognizing that he was losing the battle on substance, Levin decided to try a different approach, personal attacks combined, with appeals to his audience's political biases. Congresswoman, you can cite all the case law you want, but at the end of the day, you're still part of a party that wants to pack the courts, eliminate the filibuster, and fundamentally transform our constitutional system. How do you reconcile your supposed constitutional expertise with supporting policies that would destroy constitutional government? But Crockett had faced this kind of desperate pivot many times in courtrooms when opposing counsel realized they were losing on the merits. Her response was calm but devastating. Mr. Levin, you're conflating constitutional interpretation with political preferences. Constitutional expertise means understanding what the Constitution allows, requires, and forbids, regardless of whether we personally like those outcomes. When I represented clients, I didn't get to pick and choose which constitutional principles applied based on my political views. The law is the law. She paused, then delivered what would become the most quoted line of the entire debate. And frankly, Mr. Levin, if you can't discuss constitutional law without resorting to partisan talking points, then you're not engaging in constitutional analysis. You're just doing political commentary. The silence that followed was deafening. In decades of radio broadcasting, Levin had never been so directly and effectively challenged by an opponent. His usual tactics, shouting, interrupting, appealing to emotion, had been neutralized by someone who simply knew more than he did and could express that knowledge with calm authority. Social media exploded with clips of the exchange. Legal experts across the political spectrum began weighing in, with many expressing surprise at the depth of Crockett's constitutional knowledge. Even conservative legal scholars found themselves grudgingly impressed by her command of case law and constitutional doctrine. One prominent conservative law professor tweeted, "Regardless of political disagreements, Jasmine Crockett clearly knows her constitutional law. This is what happens when actual legal practice meets radio punditry." Desperate to salvage something from the debate, Levin made one last attempt at aggression. "Don't you dare lecture me about constitutional analysis. I've been fighting for constitutional principles since before you were born. I've written best-selling books. I've spoken at rallies across this country. I have millions of listeners who trust me to explain constitutional law to them." But this outburst only highlighted the central problem with Levin's approach. He was appealing to popularity and longevity rather than expertise. Crockett's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Mr. Levin, constitutional law isn't about how many books you've sold or how many people listen to your show. It's about understanding legal principles and being able to apply them accurately. Popularity doesn't equal expertise." The decisive moment came when Levin, frustrated by his inability to rattle his opponent, decided to challenge Crockett on a specific constitutional provision he was certain she couldn't match his knowledge on. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "let's talk about the 14th Amendment. You progressives love to misinterpret it to support your big government agenda. Tell me, what was the original purpose of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and how has it been misapplied in recent years?" Levin was confident he had her. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment was an obscure provision that dealt with disqualification from office for those who had engaged in insurrection or rebellion. It was the kind of constitutional trivia that radio hosts loved to use to stump their guests. But Crockett's slight smile returned. This was exactly the kind of question she had hoped for. Specific, technical, and perfect for demonstrating the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. "Mr. Levin," she began, her voice calm and measured, "Section 3 of the 14th Amendment states that no person shall hold office who, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution, has engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States or given aid and comfort to its enemies, unless Congress removes such disability by a 2/3 vote of each house. Levin nodded, thinking she was just reciting the text. Yes, that's what it says, but what was its purpose? The clause was written in 1866 specifically to prevent former Confederate officials from returning to power after the Civil War, Crockett continued. But here's what makes this particularly relevant to current constitutional discussions. This provision is self-executing. Unlike impeachment, it doesn't require a specific legal proceeding to take effect. If someone has engaged in insurrection, while under oath to defend the Constitution, they are automatically disqualified from office. Levin sensed where this was going and tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued smoothly. And since you asked about recent applications, several legal scholars have argued that this provision is directly applicable to the events of January 6, 2021. The question isn't whether the amendment can be applied. It's whether specific individuals meet the constitutional definition of having engaged in insurrection. Now wait just a minute, Levin said, his voice rising again. You're trying to use an obscure constitutional provision for partisan political purposes. But Crockett was ready for this response. Mr. Levin, this isn't partisan politics. This is constitutional law. The Supreme Court has consistently held that constitutional provisions mean what they say. In Powell v. McCormick in 1969, the court held that Congress cannot ignore constitutional qualifications for office. If someone is constitutionally disqualified, that disqualification stands regardless of political considerations. You're twisting the law to fit your political agenda, Levin shouted. But his voice now sounded more desperate than authoritative. Actually, Mr. Levin, I'm citing specific case law and constitutional text. If you disagree with my analysis, please point to specific legal precedent that contradicts it. Constitutional law isn't about what we want the law to say. It's about what the law actually says. This was the moment when the dynamic of the entire debate shifted. For the first time, Levin had no ready response. He had built his reputation on passionate arguments and broad constitutional principles, but when faced with specific case citations and detailed legal analysis, his approach fell short. Crockett sensed the shift and pressed her advantage. Mr. Levin, you've spent this entire conversation questioning my constitutional credentials. But constitutional expertise isn't measured by how loudly you can shout about the founders or how many books you've written. It's measured by your ability to understand and apply constitutional principles to real situations. I understand constitutional principles perfectly well, Levin protested, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Then let me ask you this, Crockett said, her tone remaining professional but gaining strength. In Marbury v. Madison, Chief Justice Marshall established the principle of judicial review. Can you explain the specific legal reasoning Marshall used to conclude that the court had the authority to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional? Levin paused again. This was another foundational case that every constitutional scholar should know intimately. Well, Marshall held that the Constitution is supreme law and that courts must interpret it, he said, but his answer was vague and general. Actually, Crockett continued, Marshall's reasoning was much more specific. He argued that since the Constitution establishes the judicial power and requires judges to take an oath to uphold the Constitution, judges must choose between conflicting laws. When a statute conflicts with the Constitution must prevail because it is superior law. This wasn't just about judicial authority. It was about the logical necessity of constitutional supremacy. By now, it was clear to everyone in the studio, and to the millions of listeners, that Crockett wasn't just holding her own against Levin. She was demonstrating a depth of constitutional knowledge that went far beyond his passionate but general commentary. Levin tried one more time to regain control of the debate. You can cite all the case law you want, but you're missing the bigger picture. The Constitution isn't just about legal technicalities. It's about the principles of limited government and individual liberty that made America great. But Crockett was ready with her final devastating response. Mr. Levin, constitutional principles only matter when they're properly understood and correctly applied. You can talk about limited government all you want, but if you don't understand how constitutional limits actually work in practice, you're just engaging in political rhetoric, not constitutional analysis. The silence that followed was deafening. For once in his long broadcasting career, Mark Levin had been left speechless by an opponent who had simply out-argued him on his own supposed area of expertise. The immediate aftermath of the debate was unlike anything Levin's producers had experienced in decades of radio programming. Instead of their host delivering a triumphant monologue after dispatching another liberal opponent, they watched as he sat silently behind his microphone, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. Crockett, for her part, remained gracious in victory. Mr. Levin, I want to thank you for this opportunity to discuss constitutional law. These are important issues that deserve serious, substantive analysis based on legal precedent and constitutional text, not political talking points. But the damage to Levin's reputation was already spreading beyond the radio studio. Within minutes of the debate ending, clips were circulating on social media, showing the moment when Crockett's detailed case citations left Levin speechless. The contrast between his shouting and her calm, expert responses created a powerful visual that resonated with viewers across the political spectrum. Legal experts who had listened to the debate began weighing in almost immediately. Professor Sarah Mitchell from Georgetown Law School tweeted, "Just listen to the Levin-Crockett debate. This is the difference between constitutional commentary and constitutional expertise. Crockett's knowledge of specific case law and legal reasoning was impressive." Conservative legal scholar Jonathan Adams, writing for the Federalist Society blog, admitted, "While I disagree with many of Congresswoman Crockett's policy positions, her constitutional knowledge in this debate was undeniable. She demonstrated the kind of detailed legal understanding that comes from actual practice, not just theoretical study." Even some of Levin's regular listeners began to question whether their favorite host had been exposed as more of an entertainer than a true constitutional expert. User comments on the radio show's website reflected this confusion. "I've been listening to Mark for years, but I've never heard him stumped like that. Maybe we need to hear from more people who actually practice law instead of just talk about it." The broader implications of the debate extended far beyond one radio show or two political figures. Crockett's performance had demonstrated something important about expertise in the modern age, that true knowledge comes from practical experience, not just passionate commentary. For years, conservative media had elevated voices like Levin's, passionate advocates who could articulate constitutional principles in ways that energized their audiences. But when confronted by someone with genuine expertise gained through years of actual legal practice, the limitations of that approach became clear. The debate also highlighted a growing problem in American political discourse, the confusion between entertainment and expertise. Levin's show had been successful because it entertained his audience with forceful arguments and emotional appeals. But entertainment value doesn't necessarily correlate with actual knowledge or accuracy. Legal educators began using clips from the debate in their constitutional law classes as examples of the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Professor David Chen at Harvard Law School incorporated the exchange into his curriculum. This debate perfectly illustrates why we require our students to not just memorize case names, but understand the reasoning behind legal decisions and their practical applications. The political implications were equally significant. Crockett's performance elevated her status within the Democratic Party and among legal experts nationwide. She had proven that she could hold her own against one of conservative media's most prominent figures, not through political talking points, but through superior knowledge and expertise. For the conservative movement, the debate raised uncomfortable questions about the difference between popular commentary and actual expertise. Many conservative legal scholars privately expressed frustration that commentators like Levin had become the public face of conservative constitutional thought, despite lacking the deep legal background that real constitutional analysis required. In this debate also had implications for how Americans think about expertise more generally. In an age of social media and viral content, it can be easy to confuse popularity with knowledge or passion with expertise. Crockett's calm, methodical dismantling of Levin's arguments demonstrated the enduring power of actual knowledge over flashy rhetoric. Perhaps most importantly, the debate showed that substantive, policy-focused political discourse was still possible, even in the current highly polarized environment. Instead of descending into personal attacks or partisan talking points, the exchange had focused on specific constitutional questions that could be analyzed and debated based on legal precedent and textual analysis. In the weeks following the debate, several major news organizations reached out to Crockett for commentary on constitutional issues, recognizing her as a serious legal mind, rather than just another political figure. Her staff reported receiving invitations to speak at law schools and legal conferences across the country. Meanwhile, Levin's radio show continued, but with a noticeably different tone. His producers began booking more guests with actual legal credentials, and Levin himself seemed more cautious about making sweeping constitutional pronouncements without backing them up with specific case law. The aftermath of the debate extended far beyond the original radio studio. Within hours, constitutional law professors across the country were incorporating clips from the exchange into their lesson plans. Professor Maria Rodriguez at Columbia Law School told her constitutional law seminar, "This debate perfectly illustrates the difference between academic knowledge and practical expertise. Notice how Congresswoman Crockett doesn't just cite cases, she explains their reasoning and their real-world applications. At conservative law schools, the reaction was more complicated. Many professors found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge that Crockett had demonstrated superior knowledge of constitutional doctrine, even though they disagreed with her politics. Professor William Thompson at a prominent conservative law school privately told colleagues, "We've spent years complaining about politicians who don't understand the Constitution. We can't now criticize one who clearly does understand it just because she's on the other side." The debate's impact rippled through conservative media circles. Other radio hosts began quietly reaching out to constitutional law experts, concerned that they might face similar challenges from legally trained opponents. The realization that political commentary and constitutional expertise were different skills created a minor crisis of confidence in some conservative media circles. Popular conservative podcaster Mike Stevens privately told his producer, "You see what happened to Mark? We need to make sure we're not vulnerable to the same kind of challenge. Maybe we should have a constitutional lawyer on speed dial." Meanwhile, liberal media outlets struggled with how to cover the story. Many had spent years dismissing Crockett as just another progressive politician. Her demonstration of genuine constitutional expertise forced them to reconsider their assumptions about both her qualifications and the broader question of expertise in political discourse. Inside Levin's radio network, executives were conducting damage control meetings. The show's ratings had actually spiked during the debate. Controversy always drove listenership, but the long-term implications were worrying. If other legally trained politicians began demanding similar debates, their hosts might be exposed as less knowledgeable than their audiences believed. Network president Sarah Williams called an emergency meeting with producers. "We need to figure out how to handle situations like this going forward. Mark's our constitutional expert. If he can be out-argued by a politician, what does that say about our credibility?" The solution they eventually settled on was to require advance vetting of any guests with legal backgrounds and to provide hosts with more detailed briefing materials prepared by actual constitutional lawyers. Constitutional law scholars found themselves in an unusual position, analyzing a political debate that had actually focused on substantive legal issues rather than mere rhetoric. Professor David Kim at Yale Law School wrote in a legal blog, The Levin-Crockett exchange represents something rare in modern political discourse, a genuine debate about constitutional interpretation grounded in actual case law and legal reasoning, rather than partisan talking points. However, not all academic reactions were positive. Some scholars worried that the debate's focus on technical legal knowledge might reinforce the idea that constitutional interpretation should be left to experts rather than being accessible to ordinary citizens. Professor Jennifer Martinez at Stanford Law School cautioned, "While it's refreshing to see constitutional issues debated with actual knowledge and precision, we should be careful not to create a priesthood of constitutional interpretation that excludes democratic participation." The debate's success in generating both attention and substantive discussion caught the attention of television producers and streaming platform executives. Several networks began developing shows focused on serious policy debates between genuinely knowledgeable participants, rather than the usual partisan shouting matches that dominated cable news. One major network executive, speaking on condition of anonymity, said, "The Levin-Crockett debate showed there's an appetite for substantive political discourse. People are tired of watching people argue about things they don't really understand. There's a market for actual expertise." This shift toward more substantive political programming faced significant challenges. Focus groups revealed that while audiences appreciated serious policy discussions, they also found them less emotionally engaging than traditional political combat. The challenge for producers became how to maintain substance while still creating compelling television. The debate even attracted attention from international observers of American politics. European constitutional scholars, accustomed to more academic approaches to constitutional interpretation, were surprised by the level of legal sophistication displayed by an American politician. Professor Hans Müller from the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Constitutional Law commented, "American political discourse is often criticized for its lack of substantive policy discussion. This debate suggests that capacity for serious constitutional analysis exists in American politics. It's just rarely displayed." British constitutional scholar Lady Patricia Worthington wrote in the London Review, "The Crockett-Levin exchange demonstrates that American politicians can engage in sophisticated constitutional analysis when properly trained. The question is whether the American media environment rewards such expertise or punishes it." Political scientists began studying the debate as an example of how expertise could change political dynamics. Professor Robert Chen at Princeton's Politics Department noted, "Traditional political debate strategies, volume, emotion, appeal to base, failed against genuine expertise. This suggests that in an information-rich environment, actual knowledge may become a more important political asset. However, other scholars worried that the lesson politicians would draw was simply to avoid debating experts rather than to develop expertise themselves." Professor Lisa Anderson at Columbia's Political Science Department cautioned, "If politicians conclude that the solution is to avoid substantive debates rather than to become more substantive themselves, this could actually harm democratic discourse." For Uyghur Levin personally, the debate represented a professional crisis unlike anything he had experienced. For decades, he had built his reputation as a constitutional authority, writing books, giving speeches, and hosting radio shows on constitutional topics. Having that authority challenged so effectively by a practicing lawyer forced him to reconsider his role and approach. In private conversations with close friends, Levin acknowledged the impact of the debate. "I've been talking about the Constitution for so long, I forgot there's a difference between talking about it and really knowing it. That woman made me realize I've been skating on the surface of things I thought I understood deeply." This self-reflection led Levin to quietly begin working with constitutional law professors to deepen his understanding of case law and legal reasoning. While he continued his radio show, his approach became noticeably more cautious and better researched. The debate's influence extended beyond media and academia into the realm of political consulting and campaign strategy. Democratic Party strategists began identifying candidates with genuine policy expertise and training them to use that expertise in political debates. The Crockett model became shorthand for using substantive knowledge as a political weapon. Republican strategists, meanwhile, faced the challenge of preparing their candidates to defend against similar attacks. This led to increased emphasis on recruiting candidates with actual policy experience rather than just political skills or media savvy. The long-term effect was a subtle but significant shift in the type of person considered viable for political office. While charisma and political instincts remained important, genuine expertise in policy areas became more valued by both parties as a defensive necessity against expert opponents. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the debate was its effect on how Americans thought about constitutional interpretation itself. By demonstrating that constitutional law was both complex enough to require genuine expertise and accessible enough to be explained clearly, Crockett had changed the terms of constitutional discourse. Law schools reported increased interest in constitutional law courses following the debate. Bookstores noted higher sales of constitutional law textbooks and case law compilations. Online legal education platforms saw spikes in enrollment for constitutional law courses. The debate had shown that constitutional law didn't have to be either dumbed-down partisan talking points or incomprehensible academic jargon. It could be sophisticated, accessible, and politically relevant all at the same time. For viewers who want to see more of these substantive political debates where expertise matters more than entertainment, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're committed to bringing you the real conversations that matter, where knowledge triumphs over noise and substance wins over style. Don't miss our next video where we'll explore how legal expertise is reshaping political discourse in America.